Euthanasia is the Greek word for the good death, although in modern terms it is assisted suicide. Euthanasia has become wildly controversial over time, especially as of recent years. Terminally ill patients often resort to assisted suicide as a way to alleviate their suffering, although at what point does it become unethical to request that a physician aids in killing their patient? Euthanasia is not assisting an individual in the termination of their life. It is assisting an individual who is unable to be cured by ending their suffering. Regardless of if assisted suicide is legal, patients reserve the right to refuse treatment, and by resorting to euthanasia, caregivers and loved ones are no longer responsible for maintaining the well-being of the ill individual. The stress put onto caregivers and loved ones includes, but is not limited to, financial limitations, mental disabilities, and the physical amount of time put into care. It is often disputed by saying assisted suicide goes against the Hippocratic Oath, but an updated version of the oath makes exceptions to previous rules. By legalizing euthanasia, patients can die in a merciful manner whilst maintaining their dignity. There are many responsibilities put onto a family during the final months of a patient's life, one of which is the financial aspect. New data shows that 73% of American consumers die in debt, and that balance is exceeding $61,000. Debt automatically falls back onto the next of kin of the deceased, and that number is excluding medical debt. If a patient is staying at a hospital long term, the expenses later on would be significantly higher. Hospital costs averaged at $3,900 a day, and each stay averaged $15,700. Averaging at $15,000 a stay, without taking specific procedures into consideration, would put an extreme amount of debt onto the next of kin, thus depriving them of time to grieve in order to prevent from mental disabilities later on in life. Bereavement-related depression is a growing problem in the United States, but the number of cases would drastically decrease if individuals were allowed to prepare for a loss prior to it taking place. It is even classified in the DSM-5 as a mental disorder. By removing the bereavement exclusion, the DSM-5 says this: if a person meets the full symptom, severity, duration, and impairment criteria for major depressive disorder, they will no longer be denied that diagnosis solely because they recently lost a loved one. There is an extreme amount of both physical and mental effort exerted into the care of an ill individual, and by allowing that individual to determine their own fate, the depression of their loved ones would be exceptionally lowered. One of the lesser-known factors put forth into providing care for a sick patient is the physical amount of time put into allowing them to survive. More than 65 million people provide care for a chronically ill, disabled, or aged family member at any given year, an average 20 hours a week providing that care. Averaging at 20 hours a week on top of 40-hour work weeks would leave 108 hours left for necessities and activities, which initially seems like a lot, but when broken down, the average American spends 8.5 hours a day sleeping, 47 minutes for personal care, an hour and 10 minutes eating and drinking, and 21 minutes for routine household activities. Once these chores are completed, that would leave approximately 32 hours a week for leisure, but that's excluding the possibility of drive time, personal health limitations, or childcare. Most humans share a common wish to die peacefully. By granting them the ability to consent to be euthanized, patients can die at a time and date of their choice while surrounded by loved ones. Regardless of if euthanasia is legal or not, patients reserve the right to refuse treatment. Ergo, they're allowed to choose to prolong their suffering but not choose to have it end. Physician Timothy E. Quill shared his stance on the topic by saying, "It would be hard to construct addressing the suffering of a terminally ill patient as a harm. It is an obligation. If even doctors are sharing their obligation to ease the suffering of patients, then why does the method of easing the pain dictate whether or not it is morally acceptable?" Another factor which must be taken into consideration is that if a patient is in a persistent vegetative state or an irreversible coma, then the family member who has been granted medical power of attorney has the right to decide when life support is to be turned off. More often than not, patients cannot make this decision on their own. Deprived of happiness and other capabilities, patients are at best utterly neutral and at worst negative in a respect of physical pain. While doctors are not allowed to make this decision, they tend to advise for it when organs can no longer function on their own. Patients are also able to sign a DNR, which states that they do not want any life-sustaining measures taken in order to keep them alive at all costs. Patients on a ventilator typically have lost the ability to breathe on their own. Sometimes this is the result of a long-standing illness. Other times it is the result of an acute traumatic event. A patient may or may not be aware and awake that they are on life support. If a patient is at the point that the physician feels that there is not a cure for their illness, or that the patient has lost the ability to function without a ventilator, or that there is no brain activity, hospice care is often given as an option for care. Rather than forcing families to make the heart-aching decision of pulling the plug, patients should be granted the ability to make the decision on their own before their condition gets to the point where they are physically unable to. The Hippocratic Oath is not used as a defense against physicians turning off a ventilator, yet it is still used as a defense against physicians giving patients a merciful passing. There's been an updated version of the infamous Hippocratic Oath, which now does not force physicians into doing whatever it takes in order to keep their patient alive, but merely to treat as best as possible. A well-known doctor spoke out on the topic and said, "I will remember that I do not treat a fever chart or a cancerous growth, but a sick patient whose illness may affect their family and economic stability. My responsibility includes those related issues, and I am to treat adequately for the sick." By treating to the best of their ability, physicians must also honor a patient's wishes and comply with their decisions. Dr. Robert Olvera, who is very familiar on the topic, spoke out on the topic and said, "My objective is that given the Hippocratic Oath, I am not going against it. I am helping people like my daughter Emily, who died after a 17-year battle of leukemia, who need help at the end of their lives. If he was willing to respect the wishes of his own daughter, why should other families not get the same option?" By legalizing euthanasia, it allows for both patients and families to receive closure before suffering a loss. It eliminates stressors put onto caregivers and loved ones and allows for an easier bereavement. Euthanasia is not going against physicians' orders, and it is not stripping an individual of their right to live. So do patients really have the right to live, or do they only have the right to survive?